It happens in an instant. You're sitting in a car as a passenger. Everything seems routine, and then the officer speaks. "May I see your ID?" A simple question. But in that moment, tension spikes and uncertainty sets in. Most people hesitate. Not out of defiance, but because they don't fully understand their rights as a passenger under U.S. law. But here's the question. If you're asked for ID as a passenger, are you legally required to comply in every state? Or is this an area where constitutional protections give you options? Let me know your answer in the comments below. Across the country, passengers' rights have been tested in courts and law enforcement practices for decades. According to federal and state case law, passengers do not always have the same obligations as drivers when it comes to providing identification. Some states require ID in limited circumstances, such as during a lawful Terry stop, where officers have reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Other jurisdictions take a broader approach, sometimes asking passengers for ID simply because they are present in the vehicle. This distinction between voluntary compliance and legal obligation creates confusion on the street. While a driver generally must present a license during a traffic stop, a passenger's rights are more nuanced and often depend on the specifics of the situation, location, and applicable case law. Official records and legal analyses emphasize that a passenger's refusal to provide ID alone cannot usually justify arrest unless additional factors create reasonable suspicion. Courts have repeatedly examined whether asking for ID in these situations constitutes an overreach or falls within standard investigative authority. The Fourth Amendment, protecting against unreasonable searches and seizures, is central to these determinations. From a practical standpoint, passengers often face a delicate balance, remaining calm, informed, and respectful, while understanding when providing ID is legally necessary and when it is voluntary. How one responds can influence the encounter's outcome without escalating tension. Understanding passenger rights begins with the law itself. In my legal analysis, it is important to distinguish between the authority of law enforcement and the constitutional protections guaranteed to individuals. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, and courts have repeatedly emphasized that passengers are entitled to certain safeguards even during a lawful traffic stop. Unlike drivers, passengers are not automatically required to provide identification unless specific conditions are met. Historically, this distinction has evolved through decades of case law. One landmark case, Hebel v. 6th Judicial District Court of Nevada, clarified that states can enact laws requiring individuals to disclose identity during a lawful stop if there is reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. However, this ruling primarily applied to drivers, leaving passenger rights less clearly defined. Subsequent appellate cases have addressed the nuances for passengers, often focusing on whether there was reasonable suspicion directed at the passenger, not just the vehicle. Federal versus state jurisdiction matters greatly. In some states, statutes explicitly require passengers to provide ID during certain investigations. In others, there is no statutory obligation, meaning compliance is voluntary unless the officer can articulate specific facts, creating reasonable suspicion. From a practical perspective, knowing the law in your state can prevent unnecessary escalation. Courts have also examined the practical consequences of refusing to show ID as a passenger. In documented cases, courts often look at context. Was the stop lawful? Did the passenger's behavior interfere with police duties? Were officers acting within their statutory authority? In many situations, passengers who calmly assert their constitutional rights while remaining non-threatening avoid further complications. In contrast, aggressive behavior or physical resistance often escalates an otherwise routine encounter. There are long-term implications as well. Public awareness of passenger rights has grown significantly, in part due to smartphones recording interactions. Departments increasingly train officers on the proper handling of ID requests for passengers, balancing investigatory needs with constitutional safeguards. Yet misunderstandings remain common, creating tension during traffic stops. In my legal analysis, one of the most effective strategies is preparation. Passengers should understand that you have rights, your behavior matters, and how you communicate your intentions can influence the encounter. For example, calmly asking, "Am I legally required to provide ID in this situation?" demonstrates awareness without confrontation. Courts would likely view this as responsible and cooperative. Another perspective is that while asserting rights is important, voluntary compliance can sometimes expedite the interaction without forfeiting legal protections. Each situation is unique, and understanding context, location, the officer's articulable suspicion, and state laws guides appropriate action. Supporters of routine ID requests argue that they enhance officer safety and aid investigations. Critics point out the potential for overreach and violation of passengers' constitutional rights. A balanced, informed approach respects both viewpoints while ensuring lawful conduct. When a police officer asks for your ID as a passenger, the first principle is stay calm and composed. In my legal analysis, tone and demeanor matter as much as the law itself. Your goal is not to confront, but to demonstrate awareness of your rights while remaining cooperative. Courts consistently recognize that passengers who remain calm and non-threatening are far less likely to face escalation. Consider a real-world scenario. A passenger is stopped in a routine traffic check. The officer requests identification. The passenger, aware of their rights, responds politely, "Officer, am I legally required to provide ID in this situation?" This simple, respectful question can clarify the officer's expectations while asserting constitutional awareness. In many documented cases, officers appreciate clear, non-confrontational communication and continue the stop without further action. Contrast this with a scenario where a passenger reacts aggressively or refuses outright without explanation. Public records show that confrontational behavior, even if based on legal rights, can lead to detainment, arrest, or citations. Courts later evaluate such incidents based on conduct, context, and whether the passenger interfered with official duties. This demonstrates that how you assert your rights is just as important as knowing what your rights are. In my legal analysis, it's important to note that passengers are protected under the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable searches and seizures. Unless the officer can articulate reasonable suspicion directed at the passenger, a request for ID is often not legally binding. Some states may have specific statutes altering this rule, so awareness of local law is essential. From a practical standpoint, compliance with lawful requests, while respectfully asserting rights, often avoids escalation. A phrase such as, "I'm happy to cooperate, but I would like to understand my legal obligation as a passenger," signals cooperation while clarifying legal standing. Courts have generally viewed this type of response as responsible, demonstrating an understanding of both constitutional rights and officer authority. Another key point is location. Public spaces, highways, and private property each carry different legal implications. Courts will examine whether the encounter occurred in a place where the officer had jurisdiction and whether any suspicion justified requesting ID. This nuance is crucial for passengers to understand. Historical context shows that passenger rights have evolved alongside drivers' rights. Appellate courts have often emphasized that passengers are not automatically subject to the same ID requirements as drivers. However, documentation of incidents where passengers were detained highlights the gray areas still present in law enforcement practice. Being informed and prepared is essential. Now, consider communication strategies. Avoid sudden movements, aggressive language, or defiance. Keep your hands visible, speak clearly, and assert your rights respectfully. If the officer insists, you may state, "I am aware of my rights, and I am not interfering with your duties." This demonstrates both compliance and legal knowledge without creating confrontation. Supporters of routine passenger ID requests argue that such checks help verify identity and ensure safety. Critics highlight potential overreach, emphasizing the importance of constitutional protections. The legal reality is a balance. Rights exist, but they are interpreted in context. Being prepared, calm, and informed ensures passengers remain within their legal boundaries while cooperating responsibly. In documented cases, passengers who successfully asserted their rights often avoided detention. Courts later recognized that the interaction remained lawful, with both parties respecting constitutional limits. Conversely, passengers who escalated behavior unnecessarily sometimes faced consequences, illustrating the importance of measured response. So here's the question for you. If you were a passenger asked for ID without clear explanation, how would you respond calmly while protecting your rights? Share your answer in the comments below. I want to hear how you'd handle this in real life. Remember, the key takeaway is that awareness, respect, and clear communication often prevent legal complications. You don't need to be confrontational to assert your rights. You need to be prepared, informed, and composed. If you found this video helpful and want more professional legal breakdowns of real-world encounters, subscribe to the channel, press the bell icon so you never miss an update, and tell me in the comments what topic you want me to cover next. The more informed you are, the better you can handle these situations safely and lawfully. As we examine the legal framework surrounding passenger ID requests, it's important to understand the constitutional foundation. The Fourth Amendment protects individuals from unreasonable searches and seizures. In my legal analysis, this protection extends to passengers who are not suspected of criminal activity. Unless an officer can articulate reasonable suspicion specific to the passenger, requests for ID may exceed legal authority. Several federal appellate courts have clarified that passengers are not automatically required to provide identification. One interpretation is that an officer may request ID to confirm identity when there is a reasonable basis for suspicion, but compliance is not automatically mandatory without context. Another perspective recognizes law enforcement discretion in ensuring safety and verifying information during traffic stops. Courts weigh both interpretations, emphasizing context, behavior, and the officer's justification. Historical precedent provides additional insight. In cases such as Hebel v. 6th Judicial District Court of Nevada, the U.S. Supreme Court addressed the scope of ID requests during stops. While Hebel primarily dealt with drivers, the reasoning extends to passenger rights. A balance exists between public safety interests and constitutional protections. This balance remains central to understanding what passengers can legally do when asked for ID. State laws also vary. Some jurisdictions grant officers broader authority to request ID from passengers, while others restrict such requests to drivers or individuals under suspicion. In my legal analysis, knowing local statutes is critical. Passengers should research state-specific laws to understand their rights fully. Being prepared legally ensures that you respond confidently without escalation. Now, consider practical consequences. Failing to comply or responding aggressively can escalate the encounter. Conversely, calmly asserting your rights, clarifying your legal position, and remaining non-threatening often prevents legal complications. Documentation of encounters, whether by video or witness testimony, supports passengers who later assert their rights in court. The role of Supreme Court and appellate precedent cannot be understated. Courts consistently examine whether an officer's request was justified based on observable circumstances. If a passenger was asked for ID without reasonable suspicion, any adverse action taken by the officer could be challenged. This underscores the importance of understanding both constitutional protections and practical communication strategies. Political and social considerations also play a role. Law enforcement policies continue to evolve, emphasizing de-escalation, public education, and respect for constitutional rights. Departments are increasingly training officers on proper handling of passenger interactions, reducing ambiguity about when ID can be requested. In my view, these developments help clarify legal boundaries while promoting public trust. In real-world scenarios, long-term implications for passengers include increased awareness, safer interactions, and avoidance of unnecessary legal entanglements. When passengers respond respectfully and knowledgeably, they contribute to a culture of accountability and lawful compliance. This proactive approach reduces risk while reinforcing rights guaranteed under the Constitution. Let's revisit the core question: what should a passenger do when asked for ID? In my legal analysis, the safest and most effective approach is remain calm, ask politely for clarification about the legal requirement, comply if lawfully obligated, and communicate that you are not interfering. Avoid confrontation, but assert your understanding of your rights. This combination of respect and knowledge often leads to peaceful, legally sound outcomes. Now here's another question for you. If you were in this situation, how would you respond in a way that respects the officer but protects your rights? Share your answer in the comments. I want to see how you'd handle it in real life. Your experiences and thoughts help others navigate these interactions responsibly. Finally, remember that preparation is key. Knowing your rights, understanding local and federal law, and practicing calm communication can make all the difference. Awareness doesn't just prevent conflict, it empowers you to act responsibly and confidently. If you found this video helpful and want more professional legal breakdowns of real-world situations, subscribe to the channel, press the bell icon so you never miss an update, and most importantly, tell me in the comments what topic you want me to cover next. The more informed you are, the safer and more empowered you become in everyday encounters with law enforcement. Stay informed, stay calm, and always act within the law. Your rights matter, and knowing how to protect them responsibly can make all the difference in the world.